Hi BookTube, it's Peg. I'm back at the History Shelf. I'm here with a book review today of a book I recently finished. It is Catherine Arnold's Pandemic, 1918, Eyewitness Accounts from the Greatest Medical Holocaust in Modern History. And you're probably wondering, wow, Peg, that's a really timely book to read or a really poor decision on your part. I have to say, after reading this, I think it was a good decision. This was a really sobering account from the people who lived through a pandemic. It's a little light on the science aspect, but there are other books that go more into detail on just the tracking down of the virus, how they figured out it was a virus. And those are books I'll explore later. I think The Great Influenza by John Barry is one of them, and there's also another one called Pale Rider. But this one I thought was very helpful in that it put a human face on the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918 and 1919, in which 100 million people, it's estimated, lost their lives. And as the book indicates, it's really even hard to have a final number. It was so devastating. So, I learned a lot of things. I've got index card full of notes from this book. I was just jotting down some things I wanted to share with you guys about pandemic. So it began in the spring of 1918, and as you know, World War I was wrapping up. Now, World War I didn't end until November of 1918, but the Allies had just gotten the United States to join the war effort. So in the U.S., we were starting to ship troops over to France. And the virus began somewhere in France. However, it came back to a camp in Kansas, in the United States, Camp Funston, Kansas. And as recruits were coming in and being trained and fitted out and all that, they were coming down very sick and very quickly. That was the thing about the Spanish flu. It was very fast acting. So as I'm reading this book, I'm just seeing the parallels to what's happening today with the coronavirus. Now, a lot of people are like, well, why do they call it the Spanish flu? It was interesting in that Spain during World War I was a neutral country. So they didn't have any restrictions on the press as far as what they could report on. Whereas for morale reasons, security reasons, Britain, and to some extent America, were putting the clamps on what people could report about. So people started hearing about the flu through the Spanish media. So it just kind of evolved into the Spanish flu because that's where they heard about it. But it didn't really originate in Spain. So as it started to spread, and the troops would go over, and just highly infectious, deadly. It's a respiratory, a pneumonia of a sort, where you basically would either suffocate, well, you'd suffocate, and you'd drown in your own fluids in your lungs. It was a horrible, horrible disease. I mean, I'm not going to get into the gruesome details, but there were several eyewitness accounts of, nurses and doctors and what they witnessed. And I imagine, with the COVID today, our doctors and nurses are seeing a lot of similar horrible things. So we'll leave out that stuff, but let's just say, there was a first wave that hit in the spring of 1918, and it was pretty alarming. But what's interesting is the second wave was far more deadly. And why is that? No one really knows for sure, but they think it could have mutated in a few months' time. It had, by that time, spread even further, so it was affecting more portions of the globe. The second wave hit in the summer and fall, actually the fall of 1918. So as people were celebrating the armistice or the end of the war, there were some brave souls out there in the medical community and some civil authorities that were trying to, let's not have big celebration parades. Well, they had big celebration parades, and it just swept large swaths of the population, the civilian population. So it moved from being like a military um, infestation, inflammation, it went from being a military problem to a civilian problem, and it just went everywhere. Now, what's interesting about this book, again, the human face of the Spanish flu. And we meet some interesting characters in here. We meet some of the earliest doctors who stumbled upon it, like the little town doctor in Kansas who had to go in his horse and buggy, and he was up all night, 24 hours, trying to go around to the village because everyone was dropping like flies. It's very startling. And then Vera Brittain, who wrote Testament of Youth, which I want to read now. This book has a couple of different references in here to works of literature or memoir that people have written who experienced this. And Vera Brittain was a nurse in France, and she came down with it. She survived the Spanish flu, but her memoir Testament of Youth covers her time as a nurse in World War I and her time as being a sufferer of the Spanish flu, as well as Catherine Ann Porter, who I'm very intrigued by, and I subscribe to the Library of America, and I've been wanting to get her volume for a while, and reading this book kind of pushed me to it, because she wrote a story called Pale Horse, Pale Rider, and that is about her experience surviving the Spanish flu, and it was pretty harrowing. Just the little bit that they talk about in here, Catherine Ann Porter, and many people said this who survived it, and I'm hearing it on the media today from people who are coming out on the other side of a very violent COVID experience, that they say that it was a life-altering event, and that's what Catherine Ann Porter said about the Spanish flu. She was so desperately sick, and for quite some time, that her hair turned white. And there are many instances in this book where this has happened to people. Their hair turned white. So extremely harrowing and heart-wrenching. So I will be, I've ordered the Pale Horse, Pale Rider entry into the Library of America series. It's a collection, basically, of Catherine Ann Porter's work, but it does contain that story, so I'm very intrigued. And they mention a bunch of other, like, literary folk, politicians, industry movers and shakers, people that it afflicted everybody. It didn't discriminate, rather like as we're seeing with COVID. The interesting thing that I learned is that in 1918, as they were trying to figure out, first they just thought it was a normal cold, flu, or whatever. In 1918, the doctors, the medical community, did not have they did not understand our modern concept of a virus. It was unknown. And it wasn't until 1938, with the invention of the electron microscope, that they were able to identify the virus, and that it was the cause of what was happening. So that's interesting. Did not know that. Also with this disease, like, how COVID began with, it's afflicting the old, the elderly, very young, the immunosuppressed. Well, it is doing that, but it's also taking out young people now too. With Spanish flu, it was primarily going for the young and the healthy. And later on in the book, towards the end, which is what I found extremely interesting from a scientific standpoint, they still didn't know after it was all over what had caused it. Well, in 1997 through 2005, they were able to get a sample from a body that was still well composed. There's a dog barking. That's my neighbor. Anyway, we're going to keep pushing on here. they decided to sequence the genome of the virus. And that's how they were able to discover what was so fatal about the Spanish flu. And it was something called the Cytokine Storm, which basically is a marked inflammatory response which causes secondary damage to the lungs. So essentially, as this professor or Dr. Taubenberger had said, it's not the virus that kills you, but your own body's immune response that does. And I think that is what we're hearing about COVID. Shut up! Sorry. Okay, I can't even talk. I've got the door open. So it kind of moves from the story of the Spanish flu. I thought it was interesting that it talked about the health of the people that were struck down in their prime. Lots of soldiers, lots of, young mothers and just, people in the prime of their life. And then they talked about, at first, the uselessness of masks. But they say that the masks are what make the Spanish flu a very iconic. When you see pictures, you see pictures of people wearing masks. And that's where it all began. But the doctors were saying that the masks were not effectual. So, which is what they were saying in the beginning of this event, but now they're saying it's not. So, but this was kind of like, and everyone was wearing them, all different varieties of masks. So, it's kind of neat as far as talking about things that we're kind of seeing now. And then we move on to the, it goes to modern day, where it says, it abated, it died away, and we didn't see it again. Well, in 1997 in Hong Kong, it was called the Hong Kong Connection. A little boy became seriously ill, a 3-year-old, and they couldn't figure out what was going on. He eventually succumbed, and they gave out his samples to different labs around the world. And 2 of the labs came back and identified it as bird flu, which they knew is what causes pandemics. Bird flus are gnarly. And this is what the coronavirus, I think, essentially, it is a bird flu of a sort. Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not a scientist, but from what I'm putting together here, from the reading and what I've seen, so supposedly the worst influenza type you can get is an H5. So at first they thought they had identified an H3, but it was actually H5, and they went into lockdown because they knew this is Spanish flu level stuff right here. And then it was interesting, they talked about this doctor who went through a wet market, which we've heard before, because this is where it all started, right? In Wuhan, the wet market. And this was like in 1997, 98, and, or a little bit after the Hong Kong incident. It was a relatively low death rate. I think it was like 100 people might have died. But he went through a wet market and was appalled at what he saw, because, the wet market is where they will kill chickens and birds fresh right there in front of you, because in that culture they like their meat extremely fresh. Well, if the bird is infected with flu, which lives in their intestines, and you take it home, this is where things get bad. So he was witnessing horrific things of like chickens who had Ebola that would be pecking and then just fall over with blood running out of they're just dead with Ebola. And this was in a wet market. So I found it interesting that many scientists have identified, virologists have said that Asia, specifically China, is the epicenter for influenza epidemics. And why is that? It's due to their ingrained culture, habits of living in close proximity with their animals. And now we do too with our pets, but they do with their livestock maybe, or their chickens, or their birds. And this is where it's very dangerous, because bird flu is something the human being is just not adapted to overcome that easily. It is very vicious. So anyway, I've learned a lot from pandemic 1918 Catherine Arnold. I thought I'd close with a quote because as I was reading this book came out in 2018, so August of 2018, almost 2 years ago. One of the virologists, John Oxford, had said that the Hong Kong outbreak in 1997 was just a dress rehearsal for the real thing. And I feel like reading that, I was like, we're living through history right now. Because this is the real thing that I think he was talking about. So remember that this book was written and she had interviewed this guy less than 2 years ago. And on the last page, we have the threat of another influenza pandemic remains a very real one. We are like volcanologists, Professor Oxford told an interviewer. Actually, he said it back in 2000. Okay. We are sitting on our volcano, and we don't know when it is going to erupt. The threat of pandemic flu is as severe as that of a terrorist attack. According to Professor Oxford, the impact of a flu pandemic in Great Britain would be the equivalent of blowing up a nuclear power station. The police, hospital staff, and military and local authorities therefore conduct regular contingency exercises in preparation for such an event. Quarantine plans are tested, antibiotics, analgesics, and antiviral inoculations are stockpiled, and chillingly, leisure centers and stadiums are designated as emergency morgues. Planning is the key to survival. And even this may not be enough. The influenza virus, that clever little virus, as Taubenberger called it, mutates constantly, meaning that a new version of the shape-shifting Spanish lady could one day return. That's what she calls it. It was known as the Spanish lady, Spanish flu, back then. Back in 2013, the AIR Worldwide Research and Modeling Group characterized the historic 1918 pandemic and estimated the effects of a similar pandemic occurring today using the air pandemic flu model. And I marked this out in the book, I underlined it. In the model, it was found that a modern-day Spanish flu event would result in 188,000 to upwards to 337,000 deaths in the United States alone. So, that I immediately underscored that, made a note next to it, because, you know, we have our doctors telling us we could see up to 100,000 deaths right now. It could climb higher, hopefully it'll go lower, but it seems to be following very much the same type of blueprint of the Spanish flu. God have mercy. So anyway, guys, I really wanted to just share this book with you. I thought it was very important. And let me know what you think. If you're interested in the book, if you have any other questions, and I will talk to you guys later. Hope you're well. Take care. Bye.